judgments of perception when it comes to kill egos. So intersubjective agreement, not to mention the stable cognition of objects under widely varying conditions, is now explained by way of, and here I quote Kant, remember what we're trying to explain now, intersubjective agreement and stable cognitions of objects under widely varying conditions, explained by way of, quote, a catalogue of all the originally pure concepts of the synthesis, which the understanding contains a priori, and these concepts alone entitle it to be called a pure understanding, inasmuch as only by them can it render the manifold of intuitions conceivable. In other words, think an object. This division is made systematically from a common principle, namely the faculty of judgment, which is just the same as the power of thought. This then is the outline of the transcendental deduction. For our representations to serve as possibilities for knowledge, they must become conceptually grounded. The categories delineated in what Kant calls the metaphysical deduction now are seen as necessary for knowledge to be derived from experience. Now, he's going to give us a metaphysical deduction, followed then by a transcendental deduction. The metaphysical deduction, to some extent, tracks Aristotle's famous delineation of the categories. Kant's complaint with Aristotle, it's not so much a complaint. He said, look, Aristotle had these categories. Kant's categories are going to be different, and they're going to be much more carefully arranged. He said, what Aristotle was doing, it's a mild complaint. Aristotle was just listing the properties of things that one knows about and subsuming them under general categories. He was pretty much governed by empirical considerations. Well, I don't want to say he comes close to saying, Aristotle, that Greek Humean. Well, Aristotle was not a Humean at all, and I don't think Kant would have seen it that way. But he sees Aristotle as sort of just putting together a lot of categories, because if you get enough of them in place, it'll pretty much account for all the properties of things that we know about. A metaphysical deduction is different. Metaphysical deduction has to do with the number, the minimum and defined number of categories for all conceivable, possible, objective knowledge. The argument as to what you would have to have, minimally, and devoid of all empirical content. This is what you have to have before the eyes are open. Now, once that metaphysical deduction is in place, the transcendental deduction then becomes the argument to the effect that what you have to have is what we have, and that's what grounds our objective knowledge of the external world. So the transcendental deduction then becomes the means by which what would have to be in place is seen to be in place and operating with necessity and universality. In the Prolegomena at 297 to 302, Kant does draw very clearly this distinction between judgments of perception and judgments of experience. Do keep in mind that judgments of perception are subjectively valid. When I judge honey to be sweet, I'm connecting two entities: a physical object that is honey and a subjective sensation of sweetness. There's no guarantee that others will have the same experience, or that I will on repeated encounters, or that my own sensation is not the result of something other than honey. Quite simply, They are not the stuff of which a science of nature is made. But judgments of experience, as noted, are quite different. With these, we begin with what is given by way of sensuous intuition. But this is then subsumed under concepts that are based on the pure categories of the understanding, and these are universally operative within the realm of human cognition. Unlike the judgments of perception, the judgments of experience hold good, not only for us, but for everybody. And so we now have an objective validity, which, says Kant, is the same as necessary universality. Objective validity he equates with necessary universality. It's in this sense that the possibility of nature becomes tied to the possibility of experience itself. Well, now we can get to B75 again, this maxim. Without sensibility, no object would be given to us, and without understanding, no object would be thought. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. So in the absence of the categories, our perceptions would, quote, be without an object, merely a blind play of representations, less even than a dream, you see, if you couldn't conceptualize things. Note that the various elements of the objects of thought are synthesized, but a given object is encountered, as I noted, under radically different conditions at different times. It retains its identity as a this or that, surely not as a result of anything delivered by the senses. In fact, to the extent that we are in the thrall of our sensory processes, it can never be the same object on any successive sampling. All right, so that's the transcendental deduction of the categories. It has spawned a huge literature, much of it critical. And there are problems that arise within the argument itself. Some of these were duly noted, if I may say with all due respect, were rather more discerningly noted by Kant's contemporaries than by many of my contemporaries. But those are not the same contemporaries. Kant is clear on the need for a process by which otherwise various and varying representations are held together. He describes the process of synthesis as, quote, the act of putting different representations together and grasping what is manifold in them in one cognition. Now, integral to this process is what we've referred to in an earlier lecture, spontaneity. Sensations, as such, are devoid of structure. Synthesis yields structure, and spontaneity gives rise to creative and flexible cognitions. We're not zombie-like in our modes of representation. But then serious questions do arise, and Kant, in a letter to Marcus Hertz, repeats a question that has been raised by Solomon Maimon and others, persons who have had many criticisms of the critique. The question is this: how does Kant account for the agreement between the a priori intuitions and the a priori concepts? They come together so perfectly. It looks almost contrived, do you see? How is it that sensuous representations are properly taken up in just the right way by the pure concepts of the understanding? The question is, it's almost like a kind of card trick, or the shell game, sort of. Is it some Darwinian sort of thing, that there might have been species that didn't do it the right way and they all went belly up, and then we came on the scene and we do it right? What kind of an argument is it? Kant says, to this I answer. I don't know that you'll find this a compelling answer. It's Kant's answer. To this I answer. All of this takes place in relation to an experiential knowledge only possible for us under these conditions. A subjective consideration, to be sure, but one that is objectively valid as well, because the objects here are not things in themselves, but mere appearances. Consequently, the form in which they are given depends on us. What he's saying is he doesn't completely desubjectivize it. But he says, look, the pure categories, this is something that the cognizer is imposing on the sensuous manifold. And as this is the necessary and universal set of conditions for human understanding, it shouldn't be surprising that we all do it the same way. Of course we all do it the same way. Analogically speaking, we all conform to the same rules when we play chess. No surprise, because everything we're doing is governed by a rule structure. So again, with Kant, he says, all of this takes place in relation to an experiential knowledge that is only possible for us under these conditions. A subjective consideration, to be sure, but one that's objectively valid as well, because the objects here are not things in themselves, but mere appearances. Consequently, the form in which they are given depends on us. On the other hand, they are dependent on the uniting of the manifold in consciousness, that is, on what is required for the thinking and cognizing of objects by the understanding. It's only under these conditions, therefore, that we can have experiences. So to the extent that the categories, that the pure concepts of the understanding are universally distributed in creatures of a certain kind, are the necessary preconditions for the understanding. That the understanding itself must merge with experience in the right way to constitute knowledge. To the extent that this is the case, we have an anthropological perspective on knowledge, but a universalist anthropological perspective. It can't be subjective in the sense that it is subject to the willy-nilly subjective states of a percipient, because the knowledge claimed does not arise, is not grounded in perception. It's grounded in the pure concepts of the understanding as necessarily and universally distributed. I've said that I would be performing a transcendental deduction in this room, and in case you hadn't noticed it, I did.